If you were a Tudor child, by the time you reached your 5th birthday, half your childhood friends would already be dead. Illness, hunger, accidents, or simple bad luck. Childhood in the 1500s was a fragile lottery, and hardly anyone won it easily. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where childhood wasn't soft or protected. It was a daily negotiation with danger, discipline, and duty, a place where obedience mattered as much as food, and learning your proper place was as familiar as the taste of coarse bread. But before we wander too far into the past, let me ask, what time is it where you're listening from? Somewhere out there, across time zones and centuries, you're settling in while an entire Tudor village stirs awake. And listen, if I can stay up digging through 16th century manure piles just to help you drift off peacefully, the least you can do is subscribe. Now relax. Let's step quietly into Tudor England together. Imagine opening your eyes for the very first time. Not in a softly lit hospital room, not with clean sheets and sterilised instruments, but in a smoky Tudor farmhouse where the only warmth comes from a fire that's struggling to stay alive. Your first breath is thick with the scent of damp wool, wood smoke, and whatever the midwife has been boiling in a pot nearby. And trust me, nobody bothered to clean that pot between uses. Birth in Tudor England was not the gentle clinical moment we picture today. It was a gamble, a messy, dangerous, often terrifying gamble that everyone involved hoped would end with 2 people still breathing. There were no hospitals for ordinary folk, no trained obstetricians, and absolutely no pain relief. The only thing resembling anaesthesia was prayer, though some midwives swore by warm ale, herbs, or the ever-popular just bite down and hope for the best method. And who attended these births? Well, midwives. Some were seasoned experts who had delivered dozens of babies with calm, experienced hands. Others had simply been present for one birth, declared that sufficient training, and started offering their services. It was a profession built entirely on reputation, sometimes deserved, sometimes wildly exaggerated. A woman might be praised as having a lucky hand, for no reason other than the last few mothers she attended didn't die on her watch. In Tudor England, that alone qualified as exceptional medical skill. Superstition quietly guided many decisions. Certain herbs were placed under pillows, special words were whispered. Some midwives tied charms around the mother's wrist or placed religious tokens near the bed, hoping to distract whatever misfortune lurked unseen. The line between medicine and magic was blurry. Most families didn't care which one worked, so long as it worked fast. The mother, meanwhile, endured the ordeal in her own bed. Hospitals were for the terminally ill, and being sent to one was essentially a polite way of saying farewell. So childbirth happened at home, surrounded by familiar walls, nervous relatives, and fabric that had absolutely not been washed with any kind of antibacterial soap. The risk of infection was astonishingly high, though the people of the time had no idea why it happened. They simply called it childbed fever, prayed it wouldn't visit their home, and kept a bucket of water nearby as if that would help. If the child survived the delivery, and survival was never guaranteed, the next few hours were a race against time. Babies were whisked into the midwife's arms, rubbed with linen, swaddled tightly like a little wool-wrapped loaf, and often baptized before the day was over. Baptism wasn't a ceremonial event delayed for visiting relatives. It was urgent, immediate, sometimes performed within minutes if the child looked weak or unlikely to thrive. Not because families were dramatic, but because infant mortality was so high that waiting until the next morning was a gamble no one dared take. Parents often hesitated to name their newborns right away. It wasn't that they didn't love them, quite the opposite. But grief cast a long shadow over Tudor childhood. Losing babies was heartbreakingly common, and mothers learned painfully not to grow too attached until the child showed signs of strength, a healthy appetite, a strong cry, a week of steady breathing. Only then could hope begin to outweigh fear. The difference between poor and wealthy families was stark, though neither class was exempt from danger. In a poor farmhouse, the new baby might be placed in a wooden cradle near the fire, not too close to scorch their swaddling, but close enough to keep the cold at bay. The cradle might be stuffed with old cloth, sheepskin, or whatever padding the family could find. Cleanliness was a relative concept. The floor might have straw strewn across it. A chicken or two might wander by. It was not the serene environment of modern birth photography. Wealthier families, on the other hand, had nurseries staffed with nursemaids and lined with finer linens. Their cradles might be carved, their bedding embroidered, but wealth couldn't buy immunity. Illness moved easily through Tudor households, regardless of how polished the furniture was. Even noble families lit candles and whispered prayers over their infants, knowing that status meant comfort, but not safety. To protect the newborn, Tudor parents embraced a blend of religion and superstition. A baby might be given an amulet containing dried herbs, or a small charm carved with biblical symbols. They might be swaddled tightly to ensure straight limbs, because crooked bones were seen not as a medical condition, but as a moral embarrassment. Swaddling kept the child warm, restricted movement, and, in the opinions of Tudor adults, prevented them from flailing into harm. The babies, of course, had no say in the matter. Nighttime brought new worries, fire hazards, sudden illness, the simple fear of a baby fading in the night, a tragedy so common it hardly raised an eyebrow in parish records. Families took turns staying awake. Even the soft creak of the cradle could set a mother's heart racing. And yet, despite the fear, love found its way. Tudor parents were affectionate. They worried, soothed, rocked their babies to sleep. They celebrated each small victory. A baby gripping a finger, a steady breath, a hungry cry, a week without fever. Every sunrise felt like a whispered blessing. When you imagine Tudor childhood, imagine this fragile beginning. The dark room, the anxious faces, the midwife's steady hands, the mother's whispered prayers, the father pacing outside because men were rarely invited in. Imagine the relief when the baby finally slept. Imagine the gratitude when morning came and the child was still alive. This was the starting point for every Tudor life, a beginning defined not by certainty, but by sheer, stubborn hope. And now that we've met the Tudor child at their most vulnerable moment, let's follow them into the home they'll grow up in, a world loud with animals, chores, smoke, and expectations. If Tudor childhood began with danger and uncertainty, the next chapter of life unfolded inside homes that were, well, let's call them character building. And by character building I mean smoky, cramped, noisy, occasionally damp, and always full of surprises. The kind that modern people would politely describe as absolutely not up to code. Let's start with the heart of a Tudor home. The fire, not a fireplace, not a stove, a fire. A literal open flame crackling in the centre or side of the main room, filling the air with enough smoke to make your eyes water within 5 minutes. Tudor people were constantly tearing up long before onions were invented. Ventilation was a luxury, or more accurately a myth. Instead of chimneys, many homes had holes in the roof that the smoke was supposed to escape through. Most of it didn't. It lingered, curled, and drifted, coating walls in black soot and giving everything, furniture, clothing, children, a permanent smoky fragrance that no Tudor perfume could truly mask. Children grew up breathing this from birth, which may explain why Tudor babies weren't known for delicate sensibilities. If you could survive your first winter without coughing up a lung, you were already ahead in life. Now, let's talk about space, or rather, the complete lack of it. Modern ideas of privacy simply did not exist. Families lived, slept, ate, argued, worked, and recovered from illness in the same room. Sometimes 2 rooms, if you were doing well. A Tudor child slept wherever a body-sized gap could be found, next to siblings, across siblings, sometimes on straw-filled mattresses, sometimes on a wooden board, and if the family was especially squeezed, at the foot of the parents' bed like a loyal guard dog. Sharing a bed wasn't awkward or unusual, it was survival. Beds were expensive, space was limited, and warmth was a precious resource. In winter, having 6 people sleeping in one bed wasn't a sign of being poor. It was a sign that everyone wanted to wake up with all 10 toes still attached. And then came the noise. Tudor homes were never quiet. Not for a moment. You had the household's daily soundtrack, the thump of kneading bread, the scraping of a pot over the fire, the bleating of goats or sheep wandering too close to the door, the rhythmic chop of someone splitting firewood, a sibling crying, a father shouting instructions, a mother calling across the yard, and occasionally the unmistakable squawk of a chicken who wandered indoors completely uninvited, as chickens tended to do. You didn't have to go outside to experience farm life. Farm life came to you. Even urban townhouses weren't peaceful. In the city you traded wandering livestock for neighbours yelling in the street, apprentices arguing, bells ringing, vendors shouting about fish, bread, or whatever they were trying to sell before it went bad. Noise was simply part of the Tudor soundtrack, and a child had no choice but to adjust. Now, the differences between rural cottages, townhouses, and wealthy manors were real, and they shaped a child's world profoundly. In a rural cottage, everything centered around work. The home smelled like earth, wool, and smoke. Floors were often packed dirt, walls were wood or wattle and daub. Children here were constantly underfoot, constantly helping, constantly learning. The cottage was a workplace as much as a home, and every available corner was filled with tools, baskets, food storage, or drying herbs. Townhouses were more structured but still cramped. The ground floor might serve as a shop or workshop. The upper floors housed the family, stacked one atop the other like slices of Tudor lasagna. Children learned quickly not to run on the stairs unless they wanted to test gravity firsthand. Meanwhile, noble manors existed in an entirely different universe. Instead of a smoky one-room home, you had long halls, tapestries to block drafts, elaborately carved beds, and spacious nurseries staffed by nursemaids. It sounds luxurious, until you remember that wealthy homes were colder than cottages, because enormous stone walls don't heat easily. Many noble children slept in rooms so chilly that even the family ghost complained. Still, a wealthy Tudor child's surroundings shaped their upbringing. Quieter, more controlled, more structured, and absolutely packed with servants whose job was to maintain order. But regardless of class, one rule was universal. Children sat at the bottom of the household hierarchy. You could be the son of a farmer or the heir of a noble family, but until you reached a certain age, 7, 14, or whenever the adults decided you were tolerable, you occupied the lowest rung. You didn't speak unless spoken to. You didn't question instructions. You certainly didn't ask for your own room because the concept was laughable. You were expected to adapt to the home, not the other way around. This hierarchy shaped everything: where you slept, when you ate, what chores you were assigned, even where you stood during meals. A Tudor child learned early that they were not the centre of the universe. If anything, they orbited the adults, spinning around their needs and routines like a small, obedient moon. And yet, the physical home wasn't just a backdrop. It was a teacher. The smoke taught resilience. The noise taught focus. The close quarters taught cooperation. The chaos taught awareness. And the cramped shared space taught one of life's earliest lessons. You are part of a larger unit, and your comfort is not the priority. Every morning began with chores. Every evening ended with smoky air and shared exhaustion. Every night was a reminder that survival was a team effort, and privacy was a concept best left to future centuries. This was the world that shaped Tudor children long before they learned to read, work the land, or bow politely to their betters. And now that we've stepped inside their homes, smoky, noisy, lively, and endlessly demanding, let's explore the next stage of Tudor childhood: the fragile, chaotic years before the world separates boys from girls. If you've ever looked at a portrait of a Tudor child and thought, why are they dressed like small adults who take life far too seriously? You're not wrong. Tudor childhood did not come with a wardrobe of pastel onesies or dinosaur pajamas. Instead, every child, wealthy or poor, entered the world dressed for a life of labour, obedience, and endless itchiness. Let's start with the most surprising fact for modern ears. All young Tudor children wore skirts. Boys, girls, didn't matter. Up until the age of about 7, every Tudor child looked like a tiny medieval grandmother. This wasn't a statement about gender fluidity or progressive fashion. It was purely practical. Skirts made toilet training significantly easier. A Tudor parent did not have the time or patience to wrestle a squirming toddler into complicated layers of fastenings just so they could squat somewhere near, or sometimes very far from, the designated chamber pot. So yes, picture a group of Tudor boys playing outside, all in skirts, all completely unbothered, all unaware that somewhere in the future, a narrator would be chuckling gently at their laundry choices. Beneath those skirts, fabrics that can best be described as texturally honest. The poor wore wool and linen, sturdy, reliable, and about as soft as a well-used doormat. Shirts were scratchy, smocks were often damp in winter, and garments were patched until the patches needed patches. Clothes weren't fashion, they were survival gear. But Tudor people didn't throw things away. Clothes were repaired endlessly, handed down from sibling to sibling until the original fabric was nothing but a rumour. A Tudor child might proudly wear a smock that had graced 3 older brothers, 1 older sister, and possibly a neighbour's cousin before landing on their back. And then there were the wealthy. Now, wealthy Tudor children didn't escape discomfort. Comfort wasn't a concept yet. But they were dressed like miniature nobles. Picture a 4-year-old dressed in enough brocade to weigh down a fully grown pigeon. Stiff collars, ornate sleeves, tiny doublets with decorative slashes, ribbons, embroidery. The whole ensemble screamed, "I belong to important people who want everyone to know." But even these fine outfits came with complications. Children weren't allowed to run too fast, bend too far, or breathe too enthusiastically in case they damaged their expensive garments. They were dressed to be admired, not to play. Imagine being 5 years old and constantly reminded that your sleeves cost more than the family servant's yearly wage. No pressure, of course. Meanwhile, back in the average household, clothing was less about impressing guests, and more about keeping warm, surviving chores, and avoiding splinters. Children wore aprons, simple caps, and shoes only when absolutely necessary. If you were a poor child, going barefoot wasn't a summer aesthetic. It was a year-round fact of life. Now let's talk about the most important wardrobe moment in a Tudor boy's life, the breeching. The breeching ceremony happened around the age of 7, though sometimes earlier if the boy was unusually tall or the family felt ambitious. This was the day a boy was finally promoted out of toddler skirts and awarded his first ever pair of breeches, a moment of pride, discomfort, and newfound responsibility. Imagine the anticipation. Imagine the weight of expectation. Imagine the sudden realization that trousers were far less forgiving when nature called. But breeching wasn't about comfort. It was symbolic. It declared to the world, this is no longer a small child. This is a young member of the male world, ready to learn proper men's work. From that day onward, the boy was expected to take on more structured labour, follow his father outdoors, and stop hovering around the women in the household. Practically overnight, breeches turned a child into an apprentice adult. Girls, meanwhile, had no equivalent ceremony. Their clothing simply shifted gradually as they grew, signalling a slow but steady transition toward a life of dairy work, household management, and the endless cycle of spinning and sewing. If boys' clothing marked a sudden leap into the adult world, girls' clothing whispered, "You've already been working, now here's more." But clothing did much more than announce gender. It announced class. A Tudor child's outfit could be read like a social resume. Rich fabrics meant status. Stiff collars meant wealth. Bright dyes meant money to burn, or at least money to boil plants repeatedly until the colour stuck. Meanwhile, poor children wore browns, greys, and the famous Tudor colour known as whatever the sheep had available. Their clothing was intentionally plain, not because they lacked taste, but because anything too nice would be ruined the moment the child stepped outside and made eye contact with a muddy puddle. Clothing also signalled obedience. A neat, well-maintained outfit told the world that your family was orderly, respectable, and not in danger of moral collapse. A torn or dirty one suggested the opposite. Children were walking reflections of their parents' discipline, hygiene, and competence, all judged harshly by neighbours with plenty of opinions and not nearly enough entertainment options. Even posture was shaped by clothing. Tight sleeves limited movement. Stiff collars forced children to hold their heads high. Heavy outer garments slowed them down, which to Tudor adults was a delightful bonus. If a child couldn't sprint away, they could be corrected much more efficiently. In noble households, clothing also enforced hierarchy. Servants dressed plainly, children of status dressed richly, and everyone was expected to look precisely as expensive, or inexpensive, as their role demanded. Clothing wasn't just fabric. It was identity, control, expectation, and survival. As you picture a Tudor child now, whether in patched linen or embroidered velvet, imagine the weight of their garments, the itch of wool against their skin, the pride of new breeches, or the simplicity of a hand-me-down smock. Those clothes shaped their movements, their behaviour, their self-perception, and even their place in the world. And speaking of place, now that we've dressed our Tudor child properly, let's walk with them into the next stage of their life, the early years where they remain under their mother's watchful eye, soaking in the rhythms of home before society begins to pull them apart. And while we follow them into the next stage of Tudor life, remember, I'm over here stitching these chapters together like a tired Tudor seamstress. The least you can do is subscribe before we move on. By the time a Tudor child reached the age of 4 or 5, just old enough to form opinions and start using them irresponsibly, their parents shifted into what we might call politeness boot camp. And make no mistake, Tudor politeness wasn't about being nice, it was about survival. True, a well-mannered child reflected well on the family, but far more importantly it kept everyone alive. You see, Tudor society ran on a strict, invisible ladder of hierarchy. Everyone had a place, and more critically, everyone was expected to stay in their place. If you stepped out of line, intentionally or not, child or adult, things could get violent fast. A careless comment, a disrespectful gesture, even eye contact held for too long with the wrong person could escalate into misunderstandings, which, in Tudor language, often meant someone storming off to retrieve something sharp. So, for a Tudor child, politeness wasn't optional. It wasn't even admirable. It was a basic survival tactic, like not sticking your hand into open flame or not throwing rocks at the neighbour's territorial rooster. Let's begin with one of the most important elements of Tudor politeness, the hat. A Tudor boy didn't just wear a hat. He entered a lifelong relationship with it. The hat was your portable status signal, your social thermometer and your emotional support accessory, but only if you handled it correctly. The moment you encountered someone above you in rank, which, for a child, meant literally everyone, the hat came off. Not casually, not carelessly. No, there was a right way to do this. First, always with the right hand. Why? Because the right side of the body was believed to be connected to truth, virtue, honesty, and generally good behaviour. The left side, in contrast, was connected to deceit, moral weakness, mischief, and anything your parents would mutter about under their breath during church. So if a child walked up holding their cap in their left hand, the message communicated was, "Hello, I am being deceptive today." Not ideal. Secondly, Never reveal the inside of the hat. That was considered rude, unclean, and vaguely threatening. The inside of your hat was your private business, and in a world where bathing wasn't always a top priority, nobody wanted an accidental glimpse. The proper technique looked like this. Approach the superior, lift the hat elegantly from the back, hold it against your chest with the right hand, head slightly lowered, eyes respectfully downcast. If performed correctly, it conveyed the perfect blend of humility and "please don't stab me." Girls, meanwhile, did not engage in hat theatrics. Their politeness was expressed through curtsies, and contrary to popular modern interpretations, this did not involve grabbing the edges of their skirts and flaring them dramatically like a Disney princess. That particular habit came centuries later and had nothing to do with Tudor life. A proper Tudor curtsy was simple. Feet together, knees bent, eyes lowered. A deeper curtsy for someone important, a small dip for someone moderately important, and if you encountered royalty, you practically folded yourself in half like a regretful hinge. Then we have bowing, which evolved over the Tudor century. In the early period, think Henry VIII's youth and the years before the royal marriages started stacking up like mismatched furniture, bows were simpler. 1 foot forward, bend the knee slightly, keep your dignity. But by the Elizabethan era, things became dramatically more theatrical. Influenced by Renaissance art, statuary, and the new fashion for appearing elegantly elongated, Tudor men adopted the "making a leg" pose. This involved turning the body at a diagonal angle, placing all weight on the back foot, extending one leg forward, bending the back knee, tilting from the hip, and sweeping the arm in a graceful gesture. A Tudor boy, therefore, had to learn to bow as if he were constantly auditioning for a vaguely dramatic but historically inaccurate Shakespeare production. Speech was equally regulated. Children were taught early to avoid interrupting adults, avoid speaking too loudly, avoid asking unnecessary questions, and avoid, well, speaking at all, unless absolutely required. Words were rationed like precious grain. A loud or opinionated child was considered a public nuisance and very possibly a bad omen. Parents drilled posture, tone, pacing, and eye contact, not for charm but for safety. A respectful child wouldn't start fights. A respectful child wouldn't offend neighbours. A respectful child wouldn't cause the family to lose work, reputation, or alliances. Picture a Tudor household at dawn. The fire crackling or coughing, the scent of porridge thick in the air, and a parent gently instructing their child, "Back straight, eyes down, do not stare at Master John's mole, no matter how interesting it looks." Or, "If the reeve speaks to you, do not answer too quickly, he'll think you're being familiar." Or, everyone's favourite, "When in doubt, bow and say less." Honour culture meant that adult pride was fragile, and children were trained to tiptoe around it like tiny diplomats. You didn't roll your eyes, you didn't shrug, you didn't fidget. All were signs of disrespect. Even a poorly timed sigh could be interpreted as insolence. By the way, this system wasn't limited to encounters outside the home. Children were expected to treat their own parents as social superiors. A Tudor child wouldn't backtalk unless they had a strong desire to test how far a wooden spoon could travel. And this respect extended to all adults: the neighbour, the village elder, the parish clerk, the Lord Steward, anyone older than you, taller than you, or simply convinced of their own importance. Respect wasn't about politeness. It was about keeping the social machine running smoothly. A child who learned to show it was rewarded with approval, trust, and maybe, if they were lucky, slightly fewer chores. A child who didn't learn very quickly that consequences arrived swiftly and with great enthusiasm. Imagine being 5 years old and having to remember a list of social rules longer than your arm. But Tudor children learned fast, because in their world, the margin for error was small, and the cost of disrespect could spiral from insult to altercation faster than anyone intended. Manners weren't decorative. Obedience wasn't optional. They were the invisible armour protecting the Tudor child as they navigated a society prickling with hierarchy. And with that armour strapped firmly on, our Tudor child steps into the next phase of life, the early years where home, routine, and constant supervision shape everything they become. For the first 7 years of life, a Tudor child existed in a small but intense universe, one that revolved almost entirely around home, family, and the never-ending list of things adults insisted were character building. If you picture Tudor childhood as a soft, sleepy stretch of innocent play, it's time to adjust that image. These early years were less about cuddly toys and nap times, and more about avoiding fires, carrying things that were far too heavy, and learning very quickly that the world was full of hazards specifically designed to trip you. Let's begin with supervision. The thing Tudor adults believed in wholeheartedly, mostly because the average household was a booby trap waiting to happen. And in this world, constant supervision did not mean gentle hovering or mindful parenting. It meant, stay where I can see you. Because there's a hot fire, a deep bucket, a sharp tool, and 3 different animals roaming through the doorway, and you're absolutely capable of walking into all of them within 10 seconds. Mothers, or older siblings pressed into duty, kept a vigilant eye on the little ones. Not because they had the luxury of time, but because turning their backs for a moment could end in someone catching fire, drowning in a water barrel, or being kicked by a goat having a dramatic day. Tudor childhood was survival training disguised as domestic life, but supervision came with expectations. By the time a Tudor child could stand steadily without swaying like a newborn calf, they were considered useful. Very useful. Tiny hands carried firewood, fetched kindling, held baskets, shooed chickens, gathered eggs, and occasionally helped stir something in a pot. Supervised, of course, but still dangerously close to flames. If a child was big enough to grip something, adults assumed they were big enough to contribute. A 3-year-old might be asked to feed chickens. A 4-year-old might sweep a corner of the room with a broom made of twigs. A 5-year-old might be expected to look after a younger sibling, which is remarkable when you remember that 5-year-olds are barely aware of what day it is. Everything in these years was designed to integrate children into the household economy. Childhood wasn't a protected bubble, it was a training phase, and every task, no matter how small, reinforced the idea that you were part of a family machine that never stopped turning. But as much as Tudor children were expected to help, they were also expected to fear. And Tudor life offered plenty of material. The fire alone was the household's greatest teacher of caution. It didn't sit politely behind a protective grate. It sprawled openly in the middle of the room, flickering, snapping, spitting embers, and reminding every child that one wrong step could turn their smock into a torch. Parents said things like, "Keep back, don't touch," and "If you fall in, it's your own doing," all day long. The warnings weren't dramatic, they were realistic. Then there was water. Buckets, tubs, ponds, wells. Tudor childhood was surrounded by water in all the wrong ways. A toddler could drown in half a bucket if the angles were unfortunate. Wells were deep, dark, and sometimes covered with nothing sturdier than a loose board. Ponds looked friendly but were frequently cold, muddy, and inconveniently fatal. Animals were another source of daily anxiety. Chickens pecked, geese chased, cows kicked, horses stepped on feet with a level of indifference only a horse can manage. Children learned to move carefully around animals, especially the ones with sharp beaks or a personal vendetta. Disease lurked quietly behind every corner. Fevers, pox, swellings, and unidentifiable rashes drifted through households like unwelcome guests. Children learned early that someone being a little warm could mean anything from "they'll be fine after a nap" to "start praying now." This constant exposure to risk created a psychological world very different from the modern one. A Tudor child grew up with a delicate blend of attachment, fear, and obedience. Attachment came naturally, family life was close, often literally. Children slept next to their parents, leaned against them while eating, followed them through daily chores, and clung to their skirts or sleeves whenever something frightening happened, which was often. This closeness built strong bonds but also deep dependence. Fear shaped them too. Not a trembling, paralysing kind of fear, but a realistic, ever-present awareness that the world required caution. Children learn to obey adults quickly, not because of moral structure, but because the consequences of disobedience were immediate, sometimes painful, occasionally dangerous. Strictness was constant, and not because Tudor adults disliked children. They simply lived in a world where errors cost dearly. A child who didn't follow instructions could topple into a cooking pot, start a fire, wander into the path of livestock, or ruin the family's weekly food supply by accident. So adults used discipline as a daily language. A stern tone meant danger. A quick snap of a command meant, "Stop now or something bad will happen." A sharp scolding meant, "What were you thinking?" And Tudor children asked themselves that question often. Despite the harshness, there was warmth too. Parents soothed their children when they cried, wrapped them tightly in blankets, shared food with them, comforted them during illness, and carried them on their hips while working. Love was everywhere. It simply wasn't sugar-coated or framed with gentle parenting theories. It was practical, immediate, and expressed in the only way Tudor life allowed. Imagine a Tudor child now, toddling along behind their mother, eyes wide, tiny feet navigating a floor cluttered with tools, baskets, and shoes. Imagine the constant alerts. Mind the fire. Don't touch that. Stay close. Not that close. This early world shaped them long before formal roles, schooling, or labour divided them by gender. Here, in these first 7 years, they learned their limits, their duties, their fears, and their loyalties. And now that they've survived the first stage of life, fire, animals, buckets, and all, it's time to step into the age when the Tudor world begins to separate children sharply by gender, and everything starts to change. By the time a Tudor child reached the age of 7, something dramatic happened. Not dramatic in the sense of fireworks or a giant feast. Those were luxuries reserved for royalty, but dramatic in the way the entire world suddenly split open and placed children on 2 separate tracks, depending entirely on whether they were labelled a boy or a girl. In those first 7 years, Tudor children lived in a surprisingly unisex universe. Everyone wore skirts, everyone slept wherever there was space, and everyone did small versions of the same chores. But once that 7th birthday arrived, or earlier, if a child appeared suspiciously tall or annoyingly opinionated, the Tudor world said, "All right, enough of that. Time to choose your destiny." And for boys, destiny began with the breeching ceremony. The breeching ceremony was the Tudor version of being told, "You're a big kid now," but with far more symbolism and far fewer balloons. It marked the moment a boy swapped his long childhood skirts for his first pair of breeches, actual trousers, and effectively graduated into the male sphere of society. Imagine the anticipation building for weeks, the whispered reminders. Soon, you won't dress like your sisters. Soon, you'll be with the men. Soon, you'll be wearing breeches, properly uncomfortable clothing like an adult. On the appointed day, the family would gather, the father would present the breeches, and the boy would be led aside to change. When he reappeared, probably itchy, slightly confused, and definitely walking like someone who wasn't sure how legs worked anymore, there would be pride, applause, maybe even a small treat. But beneath all of this stood the real meaning. Breeching was a signal to the entire community. This boy is now entering the male world. He will follow his father. He will learn men's work. He will speak more carefully. He is accountable. It was a milestone that marked the beginning of responsibility, not freedom. Tudor boys weren't breeched so they could run wild. They were breeched so they could work harder. And what a world awaited them. Almost immediately, boys were expected to follow their fathers, or any available male role model, out into the fields, workshops, and stables. Childhood became apprenticeship. They learned the tasks reserved for men: how to plough a field, how to handle horses without losing toes, how to mend tools, how to chop wood, how to sow grain, how to work through bad weather and worse tempers. A father didn't sit down and explain things gently. He demonstrated, expected the boy to watch, then expected the boy to imitate. If the boy succeeded, great. If he didn't, well, he learned quickly that disappointment made excellent motivation. Boys also absorbed male cultural beliefs that strength, steadiness, and silence were virtues, that emotions were fine as long as no one saw them. That hard work defined a man's worth, and that someday they too would leave home to work as servants, labourers, or apprentices, earning their own wages and building adult skills far from their parents. But while boys marched toward the fields, girls stepped firmly and permanently into the domestic world. If boys belonged outdoors, girls belonged inside, and not for comfort. Tudor domestic life was exhausting. From the moment a girl was old enough to lift a bucket or stir a pot without dropping either, she entered the long training of becoming a future housewife, dairy worker, or servant. Her daily lessons were endless: milking cows at dawn, churning butter until her arms ached, learning to make cheese, a process equal parts skill, luck, and mild witchcraft, cooking meals over an unpredictable open flame, fetching water, sometimes from a significant distance, spinning wool into thread because the household's clothing wasn't going to make itself, mending clothes until her fingers grew calloused, sewing, weaving, and helping with linens, cleaning anything that could be cleaned, which wasn't much, but the attempt was admirable. Girls' training was constant, repetitive, and brutally practical. A Tudor girl grew up learning to multitask as naturally as she learned to breathe, and behind these tasks lived the cultural expectations that shaped her identity for life. Girls were raised to be modest, quiet, obedient, and diligent. Their value lay in their ability to run a household efficiently and invisibly. A girl who was loud or lazy was not just embarrassing. She was considered unprepared for marriage and adulthood. If a boy was taught that he would one day lead a household, a girl was taught she would someday hold it together. Two different visions of destiny, both starting at the same age. Though the divide was clear, its impact was even clearer. Gender roles were so deeply ingrained that most Tudor children never questioned them. They absorbed the expectations, mirrored the adults, and accepted the path laid before them as natural and inevitable. And this divide shaped everything about their identity. For boys, masculinity was labour, strength, and contribution. For girls, femininity was domestic skill, loyalty, and constant effort. Boys were prepared for physical hardship, girls for emotional and household burdens. Boys looked outward, girls looked inward. The Tudor world didn't leave room for personal preference or exploration. It simply said, "Here is your role, begin." But there was one thing both boys and girls shared: very little time to themselves. With work structured into nearly every hour of daylight, neither group had much opportunity for play, at least not yet. That would come later, in stolen moments. For now, though, our Tudor children, newly divided, newly responsible, newly formed into future men and women, walk into the next stage of life with their tasks defined and their destinies outlined. And speaking of tasks, let's step into the next chapter, where duty becomes daily reality and work becomes the foundation of Tudor childhood. If modern childhood is about learning, exploring, and deciding which extracurricular activity you dislike the least, Tudor childhood was about one thing: labour. Honest, physical, relentless labour. The kind of labour that didn't care if you were 7 or tired or in one of those moods. Work didn't wait for anyone, least of all children. From sunrise to sunset, a Tudor child's body was trained, shaped, hardened, and occasionally bruised by the tasks expected of them. And the adults didn't sugarcoat it. They didn't say, when you grow up, work will be important. No, they said, here's a bucket, start now. Let's begin with the most universal childhood job of all, spinning. If you could hold a spindle without eating it, you were old enough to spin. Boys, girls, it didn't matter. Tudor England desperately needed thread, mountains of it. Every garment in every household required hand-spun thread long before it could be sewn, dyed, washed, or worn into the ground. The ratio was staggering. For every single weaver working at a loom, you needed roughly 12 spinners working tirelessly just to keep up with demand. So yes, even little boys who might later handle ploughs and horses spent their earliest work years twisting fibres with tiny fingers. A Tudor child sitting near the fire, carefully rolling wool into thread, wasn't performing a quaint domestic activity. They were contributing to the economic engine of their family. Every spindle of thread meant clothing repaired, fabric created, or goods sold. And a child who spun well-earned praise. A child who spun poorly earned encouragement, which might come in the form of brisk correction, or the kind of disappointed sigh that could carry across an entire cottage. Once children left the spinning corner, their chores expanded rapidly, especially if they lived on a farm, which most Tudor families did. Farm labour was not glamorous. It involved carrying water, gathering eggs, sweeping yards, shaking grain from stalks, scattering feed, picking stones from fields, and learning to avoid stepping in anything unpleasant. A Tudor child's day was a constant loop of lifting, fetching, and dodging. And the kitchen, that was an entire world of responsibility on its own. In the Tudor kitchen, danger lurked everywhere. Hot pots hanging over open flames, knives that had never seen a sharpening stone, and yet still managed to cut everyone, and heavy kettles that required teamwork to move. Children stirred pottage, scrubbed pots, ground grains, and helped prepare vegetables. Even the simple act of turning a spit, slowly, steadily, carefully, was a valuable job often entrusted to children because adults had bigger fish to fry, usually quite literally. In wealthy households, the labour was different, but not lighter. A noble child didn't spend their day chasing chickens or hauling buckets, but they still worked. Their tasks were designed to prepare them for a life of status, which is another way of saying tasks that look fancy, but are still exhausting. Wealthy boys learned to manage account books, handle animals safely, practice hunting skills, carry messages, and assist stewards or stable masters. Wealthy girls practiced sewing, embroidery, fine spinning, household accounting, and managing servants, not because they had to do these tasks, but because someday they were expected to order other people to do them correctly. Meanwhile, a poor child's tasks were simply survival, fetching water before sunrise, helping with harvest, scaring birds off crops, gathering firewood in winter, walking miles to collect wild herbs or berries, carrying younger siblings on their hip because childcare was not optional. It was the only childcare available. This was survival labour, and it was not optional. A Tudor child who didn't work put their family at risk because every pair of hands counted. In contrast, the tasks of wealthier children were status labour, designed to teach elegance, refinement, and competence in high-born expectations. One group learned to manage poverty. The other learned to manage servants, but across all classes, work shaped the rhythm of the year. The agricultural calendar dictated everything. A Tudor child's chores changed constantly with the seasons. Spring meant ploughing and planting. Summer meant weeding, watering, and watching animals. Autumn meant harvest. And harvest was an all-hands-on-deck panic fest that could stretch from dawn until well after dusk. Winter meant mending clothes, repairing tools, preserving food, and spinning enough thread to keep the household from freezing and or becoming indecent in public. There was no off-season for Tudor childhood, only shifting responsibilities. This yearly dance of labour taught Tudor children more than skills. It trained their bodies. Their muscles developed early from lifting objects larger than their sense of self-preservation. Their hands grew calloused, their backs learned the curve of bending over crops, their arms learned the rhythm of stirring, kneading, pulling, and carrying. Their feet toughened on hard earth and uneven floors, and while it may sound harsh, this labour also shaped their identity. Children grew up knowing that their contribution mattered. They belonged to a household that depended on them. Their work had purpose, sometimes exhausting, sometimes repetitive, sometimes thankless, but purpose nonetheless. And yet, despite all this labour, Tudor children did find moments of joy. They laughed while working, they told jokes while gathering kindling, they whispered secrets while spinning wool, they chased each other between tasks. Even in the midst of hard work, they carved out little pockets of play, not enough to be mistaken for modern childhood, but enough to keep their spirits alive. But as the years passed, and as the work grew heavier and more complex, a new shift awaited them. Because childhood wasn't just about learning labour. It was about leaving home, about stepping into an entirely new life as a servant, apprentice, or hired worker. And now that our Tudor child's body is trained, hardened, and accustomed to labour, the world is ready to push them out of the nest, sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly. Let's follow them into the next chapter, the moment they leave home behind. By the time a Tudor child reached 14, the world delivered its next major surprise. And it wasn't a birthday celebration, a congratulatory pat on the back, or even a moment of reflection. No, the surprise was far more direct. Pack your things. You're leaving. In Tudor England, leaving home at 14 wasn't unusual. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't even emotional in the way modern parents might imagine. It was simply what you did. In fact, around 3/4 of all Tudor children left their family homes to become live-in servants or apprentices before reaching adulthood. Childhood, as far as the Tudors were concerned, came with an expiration date, and 14 was it. Now, before images of servant bells and frilly aprons appear in your mind, let's clarify. Tudor servants were not modern servants. They weren't maids polishing silver in pristine uniforms. A Tudor servant was more like an all-purpose worker in training. If you were strong, you worked in the fields. If you had nimble fingers, you worked in the household. If you showed mechanical talent, you might end up learning a trade. And if you were unlucky, well, hopefully the neighbours' cows didn't mind being milked aggressively. Leaving home meant stepping directly into the adult world. A Tudor child who had spent the last 7 years learning tasks under their mother's and father's watchful eyes now found themselves living with strangers, expected to function as part of someone else's household machine. And this new household was rarely gentle. Responsibilities varied widely. If you worked on a farm, and many did, you would carry heavy tools before dawn, follow an experienced labourer into fields, hoe weeds until your arms trembled, drive animals from pasture to barn, collect hay, help with harvest, and handle whatever miscellaneous emergencies arose, including but not limited to injured livestock, escaped geese, or neighbours loudly arguing over whose pig had eaten whose turnips. If you worked around mining communities, you performed assistance tasks that were technically less dangerous, but you still spent your days around pits, tools, carts, and men who communicated almost exclusively through grumbling. Mining was an adult world, and teenage workers had to adapt quickly or risk being sent home, which was its own humiliation. If you worked in a household, your duties depended on your sex and the family's wealth. Girls might scrub floors, make beds, cook meals, wash linens, sew, mend, spin, carry water, rock babies to sleep, or clean whatever needed cleaning, which in a Tudor house was usually everything. Boys in household service assisted the steward, cared for animals, ran messages, chopped wood, cleaned stables, tended gardens, or handled any task requiring height, strength, or the willingness to climb ladders without thinking it through. And through all of this, one truth remained clear. This work wasn't optional. Servants were paid wages, usually small ones, and every coin mattered. A Tudor teenager wasn't living a life of independence. Their wages went toward clothing, tools, and savings. They weren't saving for a holiday or a hobby or even a treat. They were saving for their future marriage and the day they would set up their own household. The expectation was universal. Before you could marry, you had to prove you could run a household. And before you could run a household, you had to work in one. Discipline in these employer homes could be strict. Very strict. Employers didn't view servants as mistreated or exploited. They viewed them as investments. If you hired a strong 14-year-old, you wanted work in return. That meant early mornings, long hours, and constant supervision. Misbehaviour was met with scolding, extra work, or in serious cases being dismissed, a shame that could follow a teenager from town to town. But while the work was hard and the expectations steep, there was a surprising advantage: mobility. Unlike modern teenagers, whose biggest relocation might involve changing bedrooms, Tudor youths moved frequently. A servant might spend 2 years in one household, then relocate to another to learn new skills, then yet another to broaden their experience. Each move expanded their world: new towns, new tasks, new connections. The entire process was like a mix of survival training, social networking, and resume building. This movement gave Tudor teenagers a sense of independence unmatched by their earlier years. They learned resilience. They learned how different households operated. They learned how to adapt to new authority figures. They learned skills that shaped the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most important lesson was financial. For the first time, a Tudor youth handled their own wages. They might not keep all of it. Employers sometimes provided room and board in exchange for lower pay. But they had coins in their hands. Real money. Their money. And what did they do with it? They saved. Saving was not a suggestion. It was a necessity. Marriage required setting up a home. Pots, pans, tools, bedding, livestock, clothing, rent money for a cottage or small dwelling. A Tudor wedding wasn't about flowers, cake, or matching outfits. It was about economics. Without savings, you couldn't start a family. Without family, you couldn't move into adulthood. And without moving into adulthood, you remained in an awkward limbo no Tudor wanted to inhabit. So teenagers saved fiercely. Every penny, every bonus, every small gift of coin from employers, every extra job during harvest or winter. They didn't dream of wealth. They dreamed of stability, a roof, a spouse, a small plot of land, the beginnings of a household where they would eventually teach their own children how to work. Leaving home at 14 wasn't sentimental. It was a rite of passage forged by necessity. No speeches, no hugs at the door. No, we'll always be here for you. Just the hard truth. Adulthood begins now. And now that our Tudor teenager has joined the workforce, earning wages, learning skills, and navigating new households, it's time to explore another essential part of Tudor life: the power of literacy, and how learning to read opened doors that work alone never could. And just remember, I'm over here working harder than a Tudor farmhand to bring you this history. The least you can do is subscribe. If you've been imagining Tudor childhood as one long stretch of physical work, you're mostly correct, but not entirely. Somewhere between hauling buckets, tending livestock, and silently judging the neighbours' unruly geese, Tudor children also learned one of the most surprising and transformative skills of the era: how to read. Now, before we go any further, let's set the record straight. Tudor literacy was not a universal experience. It wasn't even a consistent one. You could meet a man who could quote scripture flawlessly, but couldn't write his own name without accidentally reinventing the alphabet. Or a girl who could read a psalm but had never held a pen because, well, pens were expensive and ink was not to be wasted on practice. Still, literacy was on the rise. slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. And this rise was sparked by something powerful enough to reshape the entire kingdom, the Protestant Reformation. When Protestantism surged across England during the 16th century, it brought with it a radical idea. Ordinary people should read the Bible for themselves, not hear it interpreted, not catch fragments during long church services, not rely on clergy to summarize the plot. No, they should read it directly. This idea changed everything for Tudor families. Even households that had never cared much for books suddenly found themselves saying things like, well, perhaps the boy should learn his letters, or we'd better send Mary to someone who can teach her to read, just in case God expects fluency. But here's the twist. Most Tudor children didn't learn to read in school. Schools were useful, yes, but they were limited in number and usually too expensive for poorer families. Instead, literacy crept into Tudor life through a patchwork of unlikely teachers. Parents taught their children in stolen moments between chores. Neighbours taught the children of friends. Older siblings taught younger ones. And shepherds, yes, shepherds, taught children as they watched sheep graze patiently in the fields. Picture that for a moment. A teenager leaning on a staff surrounded by woolly animals scratching letters in the dirt while a small child copies them, tongue sticking out in deep concentration. It wasn't formal education, but it worked. The most iconic teaching tool of all, though, was the hornbook. Despite the name, a hornbook was not a book at all. It was a small wooden paddle, like the Tudor version of an educational popsicle stick, printed with the alphabet, basic syllables, a short prayer, often the Lord's Prayer, and sometimes a few simple words. This printed page was covered with a thin layer of polished animal horn, translucent, durable, and capable of surviving drops, spills, and curious gnawing. In other words, it was the Tudor child's version of a toddler-proof tablet. A hornbook often hung from a child's belt, ready for use at any moment. If an adult spotted a child standing still for more than 3 seconds, the hornbook could appear like magic. Here, practice your letters. Don't just breathe the air, learn something. Children practiced reading wherever they could, tracing letters in the dirt with sticks, dragging fingers through spilled ash, scratching symbols into soft wood with dull knives, or whispering syllables under their breath as they followed older siblings through fields. Every surface became an impromptu writing desk, but even as reading spread, writing lagged far behind. Why? Because writing required equipment. Pens made from quills, ink made from soot or oak galls, paper made from rags, and a level of coordination most Tudor adults believed children should not be trusted with. Reading in comparison was cheap. It needed only memory, practice, and whatever teaching tools were available. So while a surprising number of Tudor children grew up able to read fluently, especially by the Elizabethan era, far fewer learned to write. A child might read a passage perfectly, then look completely lost when handed a quill. Writing was viewed as a specialized skill, essential for clerks, merchants, and administrators, not for ordinary labourers, and certainly not for girls in poorer households. Many women could read prayers but could not sign their names. Many men could follow a letter written to them but had to hire someone else to reply. This created a fascinating cultural divide. Reading was considered spiritually important. Writing was considered professionally important, and a Tudor family cared more about getting into heaven than getting into business school, which means the typical Tudor child learned to read not to open the door to literature or ambition, but to open the door to salvation. But even aside from religion, reading held real value. It allowed children, especially older ones, to interpret messages, understand posted notices, recognize names, or follow simple guides. A literate servant was more useful. A literate apprentice could follow instructions. A literate farmhand could read calendar dates, tally marks, or basic receipts. And with literacy came a subtle shift in how children understood their world. Suddenly they could engage with the written word. They could decode familiar names in parish registers. They could follow the structure of a psalm. They could read the rules of a game, assuming someone had written them legibly. They could understand letters sent from faraway relatives. They could identify labels on jars that definitely did not hold what they looked like they held. Literacy gave Tudor children a taste of independence. Intellectual, not physical. And for many, that taste lingered long after childhood's constant labour faded. But literacy also shaped identity. A child who could read was respected differently. Seen differently, trusted differently. Literacy didn't erase class boundaries, but it polished the edges of them. Of course, this didn't make Tudor children scholars. Most never read anything beyond scripture, basic prayers, and the occasional local notice. Novels were still centuries away. Leisure reading was not a concept, and libraries were rare treasures, guarded with the kind of reverence usually reserved for relics or particularly good cheese. Still, reading mattered. It mattered enough for busy parents to pause their work, enough for shepherds to teach letters in fields, enough for households to invest in horn books, and enough for the Protestant movement to insist that every English child should know how to read the Bible, even if writing remained a privilege for the few. And now that our Tudor child has mastered their letters, whispered their syllables, and learned to read the words that shape their faith and future, it's time to step into the next great arena of Tudor upbringing, the formal schoolroom, where discipline was sharp, expectations were high, and the lessons were certainly not written in chalk on a kind blackboard. If learning to read at home was a gentle, flexible affair, a shepherd scratching letters in the dirt or a mother pointing at a hornbook between chores, the Tudor schoolroom was the exact opposite. Think less, warm, nurturing classroom, and more boot camp hosted by a very tired man holding a cane. Formal education in Tudor England was not widespread, but where it existed, it was intense. Grammar schools were the pride of many towns, but they catered almost exclusively to boys. A girl might learn to read at home, yes, but the idea of sending her to a formal school was about as likely as teaching a goose Latin declensions. Grammar schools were designed with one clear goal: to take a boy, preferably from a family with enough money to keep him clothed, and cram his head full of Latin until he either understood it or learned the art of pretending convincingly. Latin was the language of scholarship, religion, law, and a good portion of anything that sounded impressive. If you wanted to rise socially, Latin was your ticket. And so, the Tudor curriculum looked something like this. Morning, Latin. Afternoon, Latin evening. Thinking about Latin weekends. Praying you won't forget Latin before Monday. Of course, scripture was woven through everything. The Bible wasn't just spiritual guidance. It was the era's primary reading material, grammar textbook, moral handbook, and occasionally punishment inspiration. Scripture memorization was expected, and woe to the child who stumbled over a verse, because that stumble might echo for the rest of the day. Arithmetic existed, but it was not the star of the show. Tudor children learned enough calculating to measure grain, tally accounts, and avoid being cheated in a market. But no one was out here solving elegant equations. Things like negative numbers or geometry were for scholars, not ordinary schoolboys who just wanted to have warm fingers for once in their lives. Now, about the schoolroom itself. If you're imagining high windows, polished desks, and a warm fire crackling in the corner, please adjust your expectations dramatically downward. Tudor schoolrooms were often repurposed spaces, the coldest room in the church building, a damp chamber attached to a guild hall, or a draughty loft above a shop. Heating was theoretically possible, but fuel was expensive, and schoolmasters tended to save their money for essentials, such as food and, of course, more canes. So children sat shivering, hands stiff, ink freezing, breath clouding in the air as they tried to properly parse a Latin verb. Nothing strengthens your grammar skills quite like the threat of frostbite, and silence, glorious, heavy, absolute silence, was the law of the classroom. Talking was forbidden, whispering was forbidden, Passing notes was impossible because paper was worth more than your lunch. Children sat straight-backed at narrow desks, repeating lessons in low murmurs, or standing to recite sections of texts until the master was satisfied. Speaking of the schoolmaster, he was the axis around which the entire school turned. Some were brilliant scholars. Others were simply men who had attended school themselves and therefore declared themselves qualified. But all of them shared two characteristics: a deep love of routine and a near-religious devotion to discipline. Punishment was not a last resort. It was a daily tool. The cane was the schoolmaster's closest companion. Mistakes earned a sharp strike to the hand. Disobedience earned one to the backside. Chronic mischief earned something more creative. One common Tudor technique was the shame bench, where a child would sit alone, marked by their failure. Another was forcing a student to wear a sign identifying their offence, a medieval precursor to the modern "I forgot my homework" note, except far heavier on humiliation. Then there was the dreaded bad hat, a donkey-eared cap placed on the heads of children who needed, in the master's opinion, a public reminder to behave. Nothing quite sharpens a child's focus like being made into the schoolroom mascot of failure. And still, children came. They came because education, even with freezing fingers and the looming threat of cane-related consequences, promised opportunity. For wealthier families, school was the path to university, the clergy, law, or well-paid positions in administration. For middling families, prosperous farmers, tradesmen, and merchants, grammar school meant upward mobility. For poorer boys, scholarships or charity placements sometimes opened a narrow doorway into worlds their parents could only dream of. But for girls, formal schooling was rare. A wealthy girl might be taught at home by a tutor, learning reading, writing, if she was exceptionally lucky, sewing, etiquette, music, and maybe a little French. A poorer girl learned literacy from her parents, if at all. The idea that a girl should spend hours parsing Latin grammar was absurd. She had a household to learn, children to someday raise, and a social reputation to maintain. Education for girls was practical, domestic, and rooted firmly in the real world, not the intellectual one. Even so, the grammar schools hummed with ambition. Picture rows of boys hunched over wooden desks reciting Latin phrases in imperfect unison. Picture ink-stained fingers, aching hands, quills scratching across parchment. Picture the schoolmaster pacing with the determination of someone whose livelihood depended on producing well-trained, obedient scholars. And picture the children trying desperately to remember the difference between the ablative and the dative case, while their toes slowly froze off. The Tudor schoolroom wasn't gentle, but it was transformative. It created readers, clerks, scholars, ministers, and administrators. It carved pathways for children who would one day shape the kingdom. And it marked a turning point in childhood, a shift from the physical labour of earlier years to the mental labour of adulthood. Now that our Tudor child has survived the cold desks, the strict masters, the heavy books, and the ever-present cane, there's another sphere waiting to shape their moral world. A place where every Tudor child, educated or not, learned the rules that governed their soul. For a Tudor child, religion wasn't just something you heard about on Sundays. It wasn't a quiet, personal belief or a gentle background hum to daily life. No, religion was the operating system of Tudor society. It shaped your schedule, your identity, your moral compass, your fears, your hopes, and occasionally your nightmares. If work trained the Tudor child's body, religion trained their soul, with enthusiasm, persistence, and the occasional threat of eternal damnation delivered in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. Let's start with daily life. Before breakfast, before chores, before even rubbing the sleep fully out of their eyes, Tudor children were taught to pray. Morning prayers were a household ritual, often led by a parent or older sibling. These prayers asked for protection, guidance, humility, and, very practically, for God's mercy in a world where things went wrong with astonishing frequency. Throughout the day, children were expected to remember little prayers and verses. Bedtime prayers were non-negotiable. Grace before meals, absolutely required. Spilling food, probably a moral failing. In the Tudor imagination, God was always watching, and he had opinions, detailed ones, on everything from behaviour to posture. Then there were catechisms, little handbooks of religious instruction written in question and answer format. Children memorised these with the same seriousness that modern kids memorise multiplication tables. Only, instead of learning 4 times 6, they learned, what is thy duty toward God? And what is thy duty toward thy neighbour? If a Tudor child couldn't answer promptly, clearly, and without accidentally inventing new theology on the spot, they received a scolding that blended disappointment, moral instruction, and just enough fear to ensure they wouldn't make that mistake again. Because fear, you see, was an essential part of the Tudor spiritual curriculum. Tudor children were raised with a vivid awareness of sin, and sin was everywhere. Lying, sin, laziness, sin, disobedience, absolutely a sin. Whispering during church, a sin with bonus consequences. Accidentally thinking about something you weren't supposed to think about, sin adjacent, but close enough to worry about. And behind sin loomed a far greater terror, hell. Hell was not spoken of in polite metaphors. It was presented as vividly as a nightmare and as casually as weather. Adults described it in detail, the fire, the torment, the eternal suffering, not out of cruelty, but because they sincerely believed this imagery was necessary to keep children on the straight path. And children, being children, internalized every terrifying syllable. Now, imagine layering all of this moral anxiety on top of the Reformation, one of the most dramatic religious shifts in European history. Tudor children lived through an era when religious identity changed depending on who wore the crown. Henry V, Catholic, but also not. Edward VI, firmly Protestant. Mary IV, aggressively Catholic. Elizabeth III, Protestant again, but with moderation, though still quite firmly Protestant if anyone asked. A child born during this century might hear one set of religious rules at age 5, a different set at 7, and a third set by the time they were 10. For them, faith wasn't just personal, it was political, shifting, and occasionally confusing. But children didn't question it. They adapted. They absorbed whatever doctrine their parents repeated, whatever their priest or minister taught, and whatever the monarch demanded. Still, for all its strictness, Tudor religion was also a source of stability. And nowhere was this more visible than church attendance. Going to church was not optional. You could skip school. You could skip chores if you were sick or clever enough to fake it convincingly. But church was mandatory, and it was long. Tudor church services were not the brief, structured, hour-long gatherings many people know today. They were long, solemn, occasionally monotonous, and delivered in a tone that suggested the minister had swallowed a dictionary. Children sat through readings, sermons, prayers, more readings, more prayers, and the kind of prolonged silence that made fidgeting feel like a mortal sin. Yet, for all the monotony, church could also inspire awe. The soaring architecture, the echo of voices, the scent of incense lingering from earlier centuries, the colourful glass catching light, the priest's voice bouncing off stone walls. A Tudor child might shift uncomfortably on a hard wooden bench, but they also learned that they were part of something ancient, powerful, and bigger than themselves. And in a world where uncertainty ruled, that feeling mattered. Outside the church walls, religion shaped family routines. Parents reminded children to behave in ways God would approve of, modestly, quietly, obediently. Communities gathered for feast days, processions, and celebrations tied to the church calendar. Children learned early that morality wasn't just personal, it was social. A misstep could embarrass the family, attract gossip, or even bring a visit from the parish officials who took spiritual discipline very seriously. Religion also provided comfort. When sickness swept through the village, families prayed together. When crops failed, they prayed harder. When a child died, an all too common tragedy, prayers were the thin thread holding grief together. Through happiness or hardship, the church was woven into every season of life. For Tudor children, religion offered meaning. Maybe not always pleasant meaning, there was far too much talk of sin for that, but meaning nonetheless. It helped them understand their place in the world, their duties, their community, and their hopes for a better life after death. And it shaped their behaviour. A Tudor child didn't act kindly simply because it was polite. They acted kindly because they believed God was paying attention. They avoided certain actions not because adults disapproved, but because heaven and hell were watching. Morality was cosmic, and every decision mattered. By the time a Tudor child reached adolescence, religion had shaped the foundations of their identity. It taught them humility. It taught them caution. It taught them loyalty to family and community. And admittedly, it taught them a fair amount of worry. But worry, the Tudors believed, built character. And now that our Tudor child has learned to fear sin, respect scripture, sit through long sermons without falling over, and navigate the spiritual expectations of a shifting kingdom, it's time to look at something far more physical and far more urgent. What did Tudor children actually eat? And how did they survive a world where food was unpredictable, illness relentless, and medicine questionable at best? When we talk about Tudor childhood, it's impossible to ignore one of the most constant, unavoidable forces shaping a young life: food, or, more accurately, the ongoing quest to find enough of it. Eating in Tudor England wasn't about flavour, enjoyment, or creative plating. It wasn't even about nutrition as we understand it today. It was about survival, routine, and occasionally, disappointment served in a wooden bowl. Let's begin with the basics. What did Tudor children actually eat? For most families, and by most, we mean nearly everyone who wasn't wealthy, the diet revolved around a single dish: pottage. Pottage was not soup. It was not stew. It was somewhere in between, thick enough to hold a spoon upright and bland enough to avoid offending even the most sensitive taste buds. It simmered all day over the fire, changing identity based on whatever ingredients were available. Sometimes it featured onions, sometimes peas, sometimes beans, sometimes barley, and sometimes nothing in particular, just optimism and warm water. Alongside this, Tudor children consumed vast quantities of bread, heavy, coarse loaves made from rye, barley, oats, or whatever grains hadn't been eaten by mice. White bread existed, yes, but it was strictly for the wealthy and for church communion. The average Tudor child's bread could double as a defensive weapon. As for drinks, Tudor children rarely tasted fresh water unless they had a strong immune system and a weak survival instinct. Water was risky. It carried disease faster than gossip. Instead, even children drank small ale, a low-alcohol brew considered safer than water. Imagine being 6 years old and washing down breakfast with ale. Tudor parenting, bold choices. Meals for poor families were predictable. Breakfast, pottage dinner, midday. More pottage. Supper, leftover pottage, reheated, with the occasional surprise of slightly more onion than yesterday. Dairy appeared when available. Milk, cheese, butter. Though milk often went sour faster than it could be consumed, and butter depended on how cooperative the household cow felt that week. For protein, unless the family farmed animals, meat was rare. When it did appear, it was usually salted, smoked or cured, intensely flavoured, extremely tough, and occasionally an existential challenge for a child's jaw strength. Fresh meat was a festival luxury. Now, let's step into the world of the wealthy, where food was abundant, refined, and seasonally extravagant. Rich Tudor children ate roast beef, game birds, venison, sweet pastries, imported fruits, and fish prepared with spices that cost more than the yearly wages of an average servant. They drank better ale, finer wines, and milk that hadn't been sitting in a warm bucket all morning. And yet, paradoxically, wealthy children often had worse digestion. Rich food came with its own dangers: overindulgence, questionable sweets, and the creative Tudor belief that sugar prevented illness. It did not. Some wealthy families smeared sugar paste on their teeth so often that their smiles looked like a dentist's recurring nightmare. But whether rich or poor, one thing united all Tudor children: malnutrition. Vitamin deficiencies were a quiet and constant companion. Lack of vitamin C, enjoy scurvy. Lack of vitamin D, hello. Rickets, lack of variety, meet chronic fatigue. Even wealthy households couldn't outsmart seasons. They had more food, yes, but not necessarily balanced food. The concept of nutrition was centuries away. A Tudor parent evaluating their child's health might say things like, "He looks pale, give him more bread," or "She's tired, perhaps a spoonful of ale will fix it." Illness was never far behind. A fever could sweep through a household with alarming speed. Intestinal worms were common, so were toothaches, ear infections, and the ague, a Tudor term covering everything from chills to diseases that definitely needed professional intervention, but instead received herbal tea. Speaking of remedies, Tudor medicine was a fascinating blend of herbal knowledge, folk belief, and creative guesses. Many cures were passed down through generations: sage for sore throats, chamomile for mild fevers, mint for stomach aches. Some remedies were genuinely helpful. Others belonged in the "please don't try this at home" category. For example, to cure a cough, a Tudor child might be given warm ale, yes, again. Honey with herbs, a mixture of vinegar and soot, because why not? Or the deeply questionable practice of hanging herbs around the neck and hoping the priest approved superstition was woven into daily health care. A charm pinned to a child's clothing might ward off illness. A whispered prayer accompanied every dose of medicine, and the line between faith and medical science was so thin you could thread a needle with it. But nothing shaped Tudor eating and health quite like seasonal scarcity. Winter was the enemy. Food stores dwindled, fresh produce disappeared, preserved foods lost flavour and sometimes gained personality. Parents worried constantly about keeping their children alive until spring. Even wealthier households felt the pinch, though their scarcity was more like mild inconvenience. Poorer families, however, faced true hunger. A long winter or a failed harvest meant children went to bed with rumbling stomachs and woke with the same soundtrack. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making disease hit harder and recovery slower. And then came fasting periods, religious obligations that limited what people could eat. Lent, in particular, forced even the wealthiest kitchens into restrictive diets. Children didn't get exceptions. If the church calendar said no meat, there was no meat. If it said no dairy, there was no dairy. A Tudor child might spend weeks eating fish, vegetables, and pottage flavoured with the faint scent of last month's salted pork. Yet, food also offered moments of joy: harvest feasts, weddings with roast meats, Christmas with spiced treats, Easter with special bread. Rare moments where children tasted sweetness, richness, and indulgence. These events lit up Tudor childhood. In a world of scarcity, any feast felt like a gift from heaven. Food shaped Tudor children physically: short stature, sturdy builds, worn teeth, and strong stomachs. But it also shaped them emotionally, teaching resilience, gratitude, and the quiet thrill of sharing a rare treat with siblings before it disappeared. And now that we've stepped into the Tudor kitchen, smoky, unpredictable, nourishing, and occasionally alarming, it's time to move into another realm where survival took on an entirely different meaning. I'm over here researching centuries-old diets so you don't have to. The least you can do is subscribe. If Tudor childhood had a constant companion, aside from chores, smoke, and the occasional goose with anger issues, it was illness. Sickness lurked in every season, every household, every village. A Tudor child could go to bed feeling perfectly fine and wake up with a fever, a rash, or a symptom so baffling that even the most experienced wise woman would raise an eyebrow and mutter, "Well, that's new." Let's begin with the greatest hits of Tudor childhood illnesses. There was plague, which needs no introduction. Black swellings, fever, vomiting. A disease so fast and so cruel that families whispered prayers even before symptoms appeared. Towns were shut down, neighbours avoided one another, and children were kept indoors, though indoors was often just as dangerous as outside. Then there were the pox, smallpox and chickenpox, though Tudor people didn't separate them neatly. Any rash with a fever was simply the pox, and responses range from calm acceptance to mild panic to full-scale despair. Fevers of all varieties swept through communities regularly. Some were caused by infections, others by contaminated water or parasites, and some, frankly, by things Tudor physicians had no language for. They simply blamed bad humours, which is 16th century medical shorthand for "we don't know either." And speaking of parasites, worms were practically a childhood rite of passage. If you were a Tudor child, you probably had them. Hookworms, roundworms, tapeworms, many happy little guests making themselves comfortable without paying rent. Remedies range from herbal teas to more dramatic purges that probably cured nothing except the patient's will to live. So when illness struck, which it did often, families sought help from whatever medical professionals were available. First, the barber surgeons. Yes, your local haircutter was also your surgeon. If you needed a tooth pulled, an abscess drained, or a minor surgery performed, you went to someone who sharpened their blade on human hair. Barber surgeons operated with confidence, enthusiasm, and a medical philosophy that began and ended with, "Have you tried bleeding the patient?" Next came the wise women and herbalists, the real backbone of Tudor healthcare. They knew which herbs soothed fevers, which cured stomach aches, which eased swelling, and which helped bruises fade. Their knowledge came from generations of trial, error, and observation. Some remedies actually worked. Others worked mostly because the patient fainted from the taste. Wise women could be trusted to treat minor illnesses, unless someone decided they were too good at healing, in which case accusations of witchcraft might appear. Tudor medical politics were not for the faint-hearted. Then we had the charming world of quack cures. If there was a medieval version of influencers recommending health hacks, it was the sellers of powdered concoctions, miracle tonics, and questionable ointments promising to cure everything from toothaches to demonic possession. A Tudor parent might be convinced to buy dried powdered toad for fevers, snail syrup for coughs, fox lung for asthma, or the ever-reliable mystery ointment, whose ingredients were best left unmentioned. And for children especially, there were charms and amulets. A small bag of herbs hung around the neck, a carved symbol pinned to clothing, a whispered prayer paired with a knot in a thread, a coin blessed at church. Did these work? Historically, no. Emotionally, absolutely. Adults needed hope. Children needed comfort. And in a world where medicine was unpredictable, hope and comfort mattered. But the harsh reality remained. Tudor children died frequently. A fever that might be manageable today could be deadly then. An infected cut could turn septic. A rash could spread through the household. A cough could worsen overnight. And parents lived with this fear constantly, loving their children deeply while knowing that love offered no protection. How did Tudor families cope? With resilience so practiced, it became instinct. Grief was real, heavy, and devastating. But it was also woven into the fabric of Tudor life. Families mourned, they prayed, they supported one another, they turned to community, ritual, and faith. Some mothers kept tiny tokens belonging to lost children. Some fathers threw themselves into work trying to outrun sorrow. Some families spoke openly about their grief. Others stayed quiet, not because they didn't care, but because the pain was too sharp to name. Religion gave structure to mourning. Families believed in heaven, a place where their lost children were safe, whole, and waiting. It didn't erase sorrow, but it softened it. Death rituals were surprisingly tender. A child who died was washed gently, swaddled in clean cloth, given a simple burial, often in a parish graveyard. Sometimes a small marker was placed, sometimes nothing marked the spot but memory. But always, prayers were spoken, the community gathered, neighbours visited, meals were brought, people whispered blessings, and through these rituals families found a way forward. For Tudor children who survived, and many did, illness shaped them. It taught caution, gratitude, and the fragility of life. It taught them to value health as a blessing, not a guarantee. Life in Tudor England was full of risk, but it was also full of strength, the quiet kind, grown from hardship, held together by family, faith, and the stubborn determination to keep going. And now that we've walked through the shadowed world of Tudor illness, the fears, the cures, the losses, and the resilience, it's time to step into something lighter. Because even in a world shaped by danger, children still manage to chase joy. After all the labour, danger, illness, and moral instruction Tudor children faced, you might be wondering, did they ever get to have fun? Yes, just not in the abundant, toy-filled, screen-lit way modern children do. Tudor childhood had play, but it was like everything else in their world. Simple, improvised, brief, and never entirely free from the practical realities of class and expectation. Still, those moments mattered. They were small pockets of laughter tucked into a life otherwise dominated by chores and caution. And when Tudor children played, they played with enthusiasm, and occasionally with a level of chaos that would have frightened the adults supervising them. Let's start with the classics. Tudor children loved leapfrog, which was exactly what it sounds like. One child bent over, another leapt over them, and this continued until someone fell, complained, or remembered they were supposed to be turning a spit in the kitchen. Then there was Blind Man's Buff, a game where one child was blindfolded and spun around until disoriented, then sent stumbling after their giggling friends. It was all fun and games until someone wandered into a hearth or bumped into a goose, which, as we've established in earlier chapters, was never a peaceful bird. A favourite among older boys was Fives, an early handball game played against a wall. Think of it as medieval tennis without a racket, a net, a proper ball, or clear rules. Tudor boys loved anything involving hitting, throwing, or competitive shouting, and Fives provided all three. Children also played marbles, though Tudor marbles weren't always the colourful glass ones we know today. Many were made of clay, pebbles, or, in poorer areas, sheep knuckles. Yes, the bones from a sheep's foot. Tudor resourcefulness at its finest. Spinning tops was another universal pastime. A child might carve one from wood or buy a simple one from a market. The challenge wasn't just spinning it, it was keeping it spinning on the uneven floors and packed earth that made up most Tudor play spaces. But toys were not limited to games. Tudor children had playthings, especially those lucky enough to live in homes with access to scraps. For the average child, toys were homemade. A rag wrapped tightly around straw became a doll. A chunk of firewood became a horse. A bent stick became a bow. A bundle of feathers tied together became a pretend bird. Scraps of cloth, discarded thread, broken pottery. Everything had potential. Tudor children were masters of creativity because they had no other choice. Wealthier children, however, had toys that reflected their family status. They might have pull-along animals carved from fine wood, with wheels attached for smooth rolling across flagstone floors. They might have hobby horses, wooden poles topped with carved horse heads, perfect for charging across courtyards in miniature reenactments of jousts they had never actually seen. And noble girls often owned dolls dressed in exquisite miniature versions of adult clothing, complete with tiny stitching and luxurious fabrics. These weren't toys so much as training tools, early lessons in the expectations of noble womanhood. But even with these differences, there were shared experiences in play. Seasonal outdoor games brought children together regardless of class. In summer, children played in fields, chased each other across meadows, and tossed balls made from stitched scraps of leather. In autumn, they collected conkers, chestnuts, and used them for games, though Tudor conkers was less about smashing and more about throwing accuracy. Winter brought snowball fights, sledding on makeshift boards, and indoor games where the goal was simply not to break anything valuable. Spring was a season of pure delight, flowers to gather, streams to splash in, and long days where chores were done early enough to leave time for mischief before dusk. But Tudor play wasn't meaningless or directionless. It reflected social class, values, and the future roles children were expected to fulfill. Wealthy boys learned competitive games that emphasized skill, coordination, and controlled aggression, qualities useful on the hunt, in sport, and later in political life. Wealthy girls played with dolls and miniature household items that subtly reinforced lessons in management, fashion, and etiquette. Poor boys practiced skills through play that translated directly into labor, throwing stones, balancing on uneven ground, running long distances, climbing, carrying. Their games mirrored the physical demands of rural life. Poor girls played games involving pretend cooking, pretend cleaning, pretend childcare, all preludes to the real responsibilities that awaited them as soon as they were strong enough to hold a bucket without dropping it. And yet, for all the practical undertones, play remained a rare moment where Tudor childhood felt free. No adult commands, no household hierarchy. No fear of sin or sickness, just laughter, movement, and imagination. Picture a group of Tudor children now, their clothing patched, their hands dirty, their hair windswept, running across a field, shrieking with delight as they topple into the grass. Picture a little girl twirling with a rag doll, a boy spinning atop on a wooden step, a small child dragging a pull-along goose with wheels that squeak loudly enough to wake the entire household. For a few moments, the weight of Tudor life lifts. These games didn't just entertain, they bonded communities. They taught teamwork, daring, resilience, and the small joys that made the hardships tolerable. And now that we've watched Tudor children leap, spin, stumble, and laugh their way through the rare gift of spare time, it's time to step into the final realm that shaped their earliest years, the world of family bonds, emotional life, and the relationships that anchored them through every stage. For all the work, worry, and daily hazards Tudor children faced, their world wasn't a lonely one. Tudor England thrived on community, tightly woven, loud, opinionated, endlessly interconnected. A child didn't just grow up in a household. They grew up in a village, in a network of neighbours, craftsmen, clergy, gossip, festivals, and obligations, and every part of this community shaped who they became. Let's begin with the most exciting part of Tudor village life: festivals. Tudor festivals were glorious interruptions in the grind of daily labour, bursts of colour, sound, music, and movement. And children didn't just watch, they participated. May Day was a favourite. On the first day of May, the entire community celebrated spring's return with dancing, greenery, and a towering maypole wrapped with ribbons that children ran around in dizzying spirals. Even the shyest Tudor child could get swept into the excitement, though some found themselves tied in knots, both figuratively and literally. Then there were harvest celebrations, the joyful exhale after months of exhausting agricultural labour. Children helped gather the last sheaves, decorated the final wagon load with flowers, and followed the procession back into the village, shouting triumphantly as if they personally had harvested every field themselves. and of course, church feasts punctuated the calendar. Christmas, Easter, Whitsun, and a host of saints' days gave families reasons to gather, eat special foods, dress in their best clothing, and pretend, for a day, that life wasn't quite as grueling as it usually was. Children loved these moments, the music, the candles, the rare treats, the joyful chaos. But festivals were only one part of village life. A Tudor child also grew up with market days, noisy, crowded, overwhelming sensory explosions where the entire region converged. Picture a child clutching an adult's hand as they step into the fray, merchants shouting over each other, animals bleating, clucking, mooing, occasionally escaping. Baskets of vegetables, sacks of grain, bolts of cloth, barrels of ale, strangers with accents from faraway towns, musicians performing for coins, pickpockets lurking with hopeful expressions. For a Tudor child, market day was an education. They learned the value of goods, the rhythm of trade, the art of haggling, and the importance of holding tightly to their mother's apron so they didn't end up lost near a suspiciously aggressive pig. Markets were also where children encountered craftsmen, the blacksmith forging tools in the heat of his shop, the cooper shaping barrels, the shoemaker stitching leather, the miller covered in flour dust like a ghost with opinions. Each craftsman represented not only a profession but a possibility. A Tudor child watching a skilled trade might think, maybe someday that will be me, which was the closest thing the era had to career exploration. Then there were travellers, peddlers, entertainers, pilgrims, and the occasional wanderer with stories from places Tudor children had only heard of in church readings. These figures were both exciting and suspicious. Exciting because they offered glimpses of a wider world. Suspicious because Tudor communities viewed outsiders with the same cautious curiosity they applied to unfamiliar livestock. The clergy, meanwhile, were central figures in community life. Priests and ministers weren't just religious authorities. They were moral guides, educators, and sometimes the only people in the village who could read legal documents without panicking. Tudor children saw clergy at baptisms, funerals, Sunday services, feast days, and occasionally when adults whispered anxiously about doctrine changes decreed by the king or queen. But beyond festivals, markets, craftsmen, travellers, and clergy, Tudor children also held specific social roles within community events. During festivals, children might carry garlands or flowers, lead processions, sing in church choirs, run messages between households, help set up tables, benches or decorations, perform small dances or recitations. Children weren't passive spectators. They were part of the machinery that made communal celebrations possible. Even in daily life, children had community roles. They fetched items for neighbours, ran errands, delivered food to the sick, watched younger children during gatherings, or helped prepare for events. A Tudor child might know every path, every doorway, and every face in their village long before they learned to write their name. And all of this shaped the child's world view. Tudor children grew up in a world where individual identity and community identity were inseparable. Your reputation mattered. Your family name mattered. Your behaviour reflected on the household. The community watched, not maliciously, but attentively, because survival depended on cooperation. A Tudor child learned early that you greet neighbours respectfully, you help when asked, you participate in feast days, you attend church, you avoid public misbehaviour unless you enjoy being discussed by elderly villagers for the next decade. Community gave Tudor children security, belonging, education, entertainment, and, occasionally, pressure. But it also gave them connection. A child didn't face life's challenges alone. They grew up surrounded by people who knew them, guided them, corrected them, and celebrated with them. And now that we've wandered through the Tudor village, past market stalls, festival dances, craftsmen's workshops, and church doors, it's time to step into something more personal and intimate. Let's explore the world inside the Tudor household, the relationships, emotions, and bonds that shape childhood at its core. For all the work, danger, discipline and expectations that shaped Tudor childhood, there was another world beneath it all. The inner world of the child, a world of fear and pride, hope and belonging, laughter and grief, all woven together in ways that made Tudor children surprisingly resilient, surprisingly thoughtful, and surprisingly human. Let's begin with one of the most misunderstood questions. Were Tudor parents affectionate? Yes, deeply so. But their affection looked different from ours. A Tudor parent might not gush emotionally, or tuck handwritten notes into lunch baskets, or say "I'm proud of you" as often as modern parents do. But they showed love through presence, guidance, shared work, and protection. Picture a mother braiding her child's hair before a long day of chores. A father lifting a small child onto his knee after supper, letting them fall asleep against his shoulder. Parents teaching skills, comforting fevers, praying over their little ones during storms or sicknesses. Their tenderness existed. It was simply tempered by survival realism. Parents knew any child could be lost suddenly. They couldn't afford illusions. Their love was fierce, practical, and constantly shadowed by fear. This created a blend of warmth and caution that shaped every Tudor child's emotional foundation. Then we have siblings, perhaps the most powerful emotional anchors in a Tudor child's life. Siblings worked together. They shared beds, chores, food, clothes, and secrets. They whispered during long winter evenings while spinning wool. They played together in stolen moments. They defended each other from neighbourhood children, or occasionally from the household goose. Older siblings cared for younger ones with an almost parental responsibility. A 7-year-old might carry a toddler on their hip with practiced skill. A 10-year-old might soothe a feverish 4-year-old, while the adults handled nighttime tasks. Because in Tudor life, siblings weren't just family. They were teammates in the daily struggle to make everything run. And with shared responsibility came shared pride. A child who helped a sibling succeed felt a sense of accomplishment. A child who learned a task earlier than expected carried that pride all day, like a hidden treasure. But alongside pride lived fear, not constant terror, but an ever-present awareness that life was fragile. Fear of illness, fear of fire, fear of angering an adult. Fear of losing a sibling, fear of stepping too far beyond the boundaries of expected behaviour. Fear shaped Tudor childhood not as a crushing weight, but as a guiding force. It made children cautious, observant, alert. They learned quickly what adults expected of them, because failing those expectations brought consequences, sometimes harsh ones. Strictness left emotional marks, of course. A Tudor child learned to speak politely, move carefully, obey instantly. They internalized discipline in ways that might look rigid to us today, but to them structure was safety. Yet remarkably, this strictness did not crush their spirits. In fact, it often built resilience. Tudor children adapted constantly, to seasons, to illnesses, to labour demands, to shifting religious rules, to households they moved into at 14, to adults whose moods could change with the weather. Adaptability became second nature. They learned to keep going, even after hardship, even after loss. And loss was something they understood intimately. The emotional impact of childhood mortality ran deep. A child might lose a sibling, a cousin, a neighbour, a friend they played leapfrog with only last week. Grief weighed on Tudor children, though adults rarely asked them to speak about it. People simply mourned together, quietly, communally, with ritual and prayer. A child absorbed this grief, learned its shape, and carried its lessons into adulthood. This exposure to mortality did not make Tudor children numb. It made them profoundly aware of life's value. They cherished small joys because joys were rare. A sweet treat, a festival dance, a moment of praise, a successful task. A warm sibling beside them at night. These everyday moments glowed brighter precisely because they lived in a world where nothing was guaranteed. And through all of this, the work, the fear, the tenderness, the expectations, the grief, Tudor children developed an emotional identity that stayed with them forever. They grew into adults who valued duty, community, humility, and faith. Adults who believed in the importance of work. Adults shaped by childhood memories of shared labour, shared meals, shared losses. Adults who passed these same lessons on to their own children, because that was how the world made sense. But they also carried warmth, laughter from summer fields, the comfort of familiar hands guiding them, the pride of mastering early tasks, the closeness of family gathered around a single fire, the awe of church rituals, the excitement of festivals, the thrill of rare toys or games, the feeling of belonging to something larger than themselves. This emotional landscape wasn't bleak or joyless. It was balanced, shaped by hardship but brightened by community. If you could speak to a Tudor child about their feelings, not in a modern therapeutic sense, but in the simple way Tudor people understood emotions, they might tell you, "I work hard, I am loved, life is dangerous, but I have my family, I have my place, I know who I am." And so, with their emotional world shaped by affection, fear, duty, resilience, and deep belonging, Tudor children stepped steadily toward adulthood, ready for the next chapter of life that awaited them. And now that we've explored their inner landscape, it's time to look at the thing that completes every Tudor childhood, the path from youth to full adulthood, where identity, marriage, work, and independence converge. As we drift slowly out of Tudor England, take a moment to breathe and let the weight of this journey settle gently around you. You've walked beside children who lived 500 years ago, children who rose with the sun, worked with tired little hands, whispered prayers in cold church pews, dodged angry geese, played with rag dolls and wooden tops, and learned to face a world that was often unpredictable, demanding, and unkind. And yet, they were remarkably resilient. They found joy in small things, a sweet treat at a festival, a moment of laughter during chores, the warmth of siblings curled beside them in bed. They learned strength early, not because anyone praised grit, but because their world required it. They loved deeply, feared wisely, adapted constantly, and held on to whatever glimmers of comfort they could find. Now compare that world with where you are. You're lying in a quiet room, wrapped in softness a Tudor child couldn't imagine, drifting off to a story told centuries after their little footsteps faded into the past. Your worries don't include plague or pottage shortages, or remembering when to remove your hat in front of a local noble. You aren't sleeping beside a smoky hearth, or listening for wolves, or hoping your candle doesn't sputter out during a storm. No, you're here, safe, warm, calm. And for a little while, you've let the world slow down around you. Before you drift fully into sleep, here's a gentle invitation, soft as a Tudor mother smoothing linen over a cradle. If this journey helped you relax, helped you escape, or helped you drift toward rest, remember to subscribe so you don't miss the next time we wander through history together. Let the story settle now. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift like lantern lights slipping across a still river. The Tudor children have returned to their quiet cottages, their flickering hearths, their patchwork beds. Their voices grow faint, then softer still, until only the comfort of stillness remains. And as you slip into sleep, just know, truly, your support keeps these stories alive. If you subscribe, you're not just watching, you're helping me keep this little corner of history breathing.